Here in studio, you and I usually speak over a Zoom call,
Indeed.
but now we can do it in person. She's an African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure, Energy and Digitisation. That is a massive portfolio. You've been sitting in these sessions talking about these very important issues. You've heard Vuyo and I just talk about the fact that we've reached a declaration almost unanimously. It's probably safer to say by majority consensus. But tell us about what are some of the key discussions putting Africa at the forefront of the portfolios that you're in charge of?
Great, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to talk to you. I think when we recall the Pan-African vision, we say that we want to have the African continent that is prosperous, that is integrated, that is a dynamic force in the international arena.
Yeah.
So our participation in the AU is giving expression to that. We want to infuse the African voice and the African position in all the conversations, whether we're talking transition. I mean, that's a big agenda item, the energy transition and what justice means when it comes to transition. So we've got an obligation to infuse the African position. The digital agenda is another big area of work around the ethics of AI, around data governance, around the governance around public digital infrastructure, for example. So as the African Union, we've been quite central in the conversations from senior officials levels to ministerial levels up until now in the summit, where we have infused the AU view. One big announcement that we will find in the declaration itself is about AI for Africa initiative that we launched through this entire G20.
AI for Africa?
AI for Africa.
Right.
And that speaks to the value chain of investments required for AI and adoption on the continent, the training that is required, the ethics of AI that is required, and localizing AI for African realities and African languages, African cultures, so that we don't have bias when it comes to the information generation around AI. Quite a big area of work. So as the African Union, we've led that work, and we're quite pleased that it's been adopted as a core agenda item of the G20.
Yeah.
Similarly, around energy, we were quite involved.
Before you move on to energy, Lerato, I want to focus on AI for just a moment because it almost feels like, it's wonderful. Like these tools are incredible for what they can do for education, on how they can open up doors for learning for children, particularly in areas that are struggling with schooling. There are just so many positives to artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
But is around our level of preparation on the African continent and perhaps on particular areas of the African continent should things go wrong. And I'm talking about, for example, in the banking sector, where we know a lot of fraud now is either as a result of AI or someone cloning your details or whatever the case might be. Are we prepared for worst case scenarios insofar as AI is concerned?
The level of preparation has to also entail us being at the table right now. We cannot wait for ideal circumstances. So we are saying we do want to be at the seat of decision making in the co-creation of the governance principles, because the whole world is at risk when it comes to issues of cybersecurity, data security and sovereignty, etc. So we are saying that we are mindful that data is going to be the big resource that's going to be, at the center of exactly.
Yeah.
So whoever adds value to data, it's just like with the mineral conversation. Whoever beneficiates the minerals has the power. Similarly with data, right now all of Africa exports data abroad, and then we import it back in, formulated and value added and compartmentalized. That's really the conversations we're having to say we do want to have data centers on the African continent, but we are mindful that in doing so, we do need to have the necessary infrastructure. So that is where then the interconnectedness comes in. Where's our energy? Is it reliable? Is it affordable? Is it accessible enough to power data centers? So as we are having the digital
even
conversation,
data costs.
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. So that's then what compels us to be at the table, because we need to be able to speak to all these different areas and gaps that we have as a continent, and not sit there, feel sorry for ourselves to say we don't have the infrastructure yet. We are saying yes, we do not have it as yet, but these are plans to come to it, and this is the kind of governance we would want to see as Africa.
You'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but the AU hasn't been a part of the G20 for very long. Is 2023 the right date that I have in my mind?
I believe 2024 officially. I can confirm that, but we are very new.
Yeah.
We are very new. Similar with the EU. I think the EU just joined now after us. So we are new entrants, and we're quite pleased that we have a seat at the table, and we can advance a position of 55 member states.
Yeah. And I suppose that is then difficult to answer the question about, how valuable. Because critics of the G20 Leaders Summit will say it's a talk shop, it's people getting together to talk at the table, none of the declarations are binding, it essentially just depends on peer pressure. We just need to make sure that, you're following up on A and I'm following up on B. Can you yet speak to the efficacy of the G20 and the AU, whether member states have seen, even in some small way, a payback of being invited into this body?
Absolutely. We anticipate continuous payback. One, the African voice will reverberate when decisions are taken, whether at the AU, whether it's the G7 sitting together. Also, some of the debates and conversations we've had here under the G20 found expression at COP, by the way.
Yeah.
So in as much as it's not a binding arrangement, the debates and the conversations find expression elsewhere. And we are quite mindful of how pivotal that is. For example, going into the EU Summit in February 2026, some of the recommendations, if not all, will be infused in the EU Summit. So similarly with the EU, the EU summits. So there's tremendous value in the conversations and in making sure that the G20 continues. Doesn't have to be a binding framework necessarily, but we do know that even what came out of the B20, which is the business formation of the G20, is going to be quite pivotal in advancing our conversations around financing, around private sector participation, etc. So we take this very seriously because we've seen the echoes of G20 discussions finding expression in other multilateral platforms that are more binding.
And no matter what the US will tell you, it is about multilateralism.
Absolutely.
Lerato, stay with us. Lerato Mataboge is joining us as we discuss an important variety of issues, but she is the African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure, Energy and Digitization. We'll talk more about AI on the African continent and more about this declaration that we're told has received such resounding consensus. You're live here on 405 on what is a special broadcast of the G20 Leaders Summit. I'm Michelle Craig. My co-anchor Vuyo Mvoko will be back in just a moment. Stay with us. very good afternoon to you once again. It's just a touch after 1 o'clock this Saturday afternoon, and you are live here at Nasrec in Johannesburg for what is a special broadcast of the G20 Leaders Summit. I'm Michelle Craig, my colleague Vuyo Mvoko, and we'll take you through a whole range of important discussions, not only here at the Leaders Summit, but the peripheral issues that are feeding into what's unfolding in Italy.
Have an impact on what is happening here, but we still have you at the. I wanted to touch on infrastructure a bit, because that is a big part of our problem as a continent. That Africa Free Trade Agreement will amount to nothing if we can't deal with the infrastructure issues. Are we really making a progress as a continent within and among ourselves first, before we can ask the world to come invest?
Yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head. Infrastructure and the deficit of infrastructure on the continent is quite a big issue. But there's tremendous progress that has been made. Firstly, at policy level, when it comes to aviation, we are now implementing a single air transport market for the continent. Coming to electricity, our single electricity market that is connecting our different energy power pools. And now increasingly we are advancing the work on the digital front, on AI, on digital public infrastructure, etc. Now, the deficit of actual infrastructure project is where and that is what we are looking to address. And some of the conversation in G20 is looking at that, on how do we bring in more private sector to bear to deliver the infrastructure that we need. The policy frameworks are there, so we don't even need to worry anymore around that soft infrastructure layer.
Just to go back to the very basics again, the reason why Vuyo has brought up infrastructure and the reason why it is so important is because for a country like ours, struggling with massive unemployment rate, more than half of our young people are sitting at home without a job. This is where infrastructure problems become so important.
Absolutely. The huge African infrastructure build is the big job generator of the now and of the future.
Yeah.
And one of the key questions we've been saying to everybody throughout, including through the B20 conversation, is the generic response has been Africa does not have bankable projects. So what is bankability? We need to get to the source of how do we get to the bankable projects? How do we do the necessary project preparation that gets us over the line? Because there's been quite a lot of investments in project preparation throughout that's a whole economy in itself, right? To prepare projects. But at the end of it, we've got a deficit of bankable projects. So we are having those decisive conversations around, we need to get over the line now.
Yeah.
And say when it comes to energy, these are the interconnectors we need to build. When it comes to data centers on the digital front, this is concretely what they need to look like, where they need to be. And the cross-border rail and road connectivity and the ports upgrades that we need to have in concrete terms. So as the African Union, really, that is where we are. We've taken this very seriously, working much more closely with our regional economic communities as well, because those are literally the real integrators, the RECs. And bringing them central to the solution as we build the cross-border infrastructure that we need.
So you've talked about infrastructure build, you've talked about rail, ports, and the common theme for me, at least in our country, that comes through just those three issues is corruption. And you're smiling because I think you knew exactly where I was going with the question. It's a massive issue. We're losing hundreds of millions of rand that could be better put to service delivery. We ask the question over and over, how do we get to the bottom of corruption? We are starting to do that, and we have for some time through various inquiries. We've now got the inquiry into the criminal justice system in South Africa. But the construction mafia is a huge thorn in the side of the police and of young business owners as well. How much of an issue is this also on the rest of the continent?
I think firstly we must commend South Africa and the efforts to really deal with the issues of security around infrastructure. I think there's a whole body of work around securitization and the security of infrastructure across the board. It's a global issue, securing real infrastructure anywhere. So some of the work that South Africa is doing really to get to the bottom of some of the challenges that the country has faced. It's also good lessons for the rest of, not just the rest of Africa really, the rest of the world. Because I really don't want to localize it as an African problem. It's a global problem in that regard.
It's just that our resources are so much more limited on the African continent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the regional and cross-border collaboration becomes much more pivotal because I think there's room for joint actions among countries, particularly neighboring countries, for joint security and collaboration around infrastructure, real physical infrastructure protection, and the governance of the infrastructure. So that is why even at the AU, the PIDA Program for Infrastructure Development on Africa, is really more anchored on the multi-country cross-border nature of infrastructure, so that we can also enable an agenda, the hand-holding, as it were, of regional communities, of neighbors in that regard, because no one country really can do it alone.
Yeah.
Bottom line, or shall we say, at the end of the day, it has to be about growing our economy.
Yes.
And that is what, as much as AI, for instance, in last year's declaration was identified as an enabler, but if you can't grow the economy and get people who are investing, technology and IT, then you're not going to be able to do any of the things that we're supposed to do. You're not going to get people to come and invest in your infrastructure projects, or, as you're pointing out, bankable infrastructure projects.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're spot on. At the end of the day, everybody's key performance indicator has to be the prosperity that we've created, not just for countries but for individuals. And that's really what also Agenda 2063 is anchored on, to say we want to build a prosperous Africa. And defining that prosperity says that we want every country on the continent, all 55, to at minimum have reached middle income status. So there is a real clear target. But beyond that, it's also about the prosperity of the individual. So that is not inequitable growth. It's growth that actually improves the lives of people. And we are quite mindful that infrastructure is a strategic instrument in getting us to do that across the board, not just at project level, but also the harnessing of innovation and the skills and the know-how of African young people who really have amazing ideas around growth. So how do we create the right ecosystems that can then harness all that knowledge, so that it's not all taken abroad and we suffer the brain drain that we continue to do. So the conversations we're having really, even in the digital economy, is how do we ring fence African know-how and African innovation, and how do we avoid the leakage? Difficult conversations to be had, and we have to think creatively and think out the box around accommodating this whole ecosystem of African prosperity. Our knowledge, our financing, including African financing, that's another pivotal area of work that we are looking at, to finance infrastructure by ourselves, for ourselves, and crowd in external partners where we need, instead of being led by external partners. That's a whole nother area of work that we've been focusing on, and the B20 has been quite instrumental as well in that.
Well, let me ask you this. How will your preparation be for the next G20? How will it differ from your preparation for South Africa's G20? Because we know the US takes over the baton from South Africa on the 1st of December.
Well, the tradition is that when you hand over the body of work, including the declaration, the next chairperson enhances what has been started. I mean, South Africa's chairship has enhanced what was built from Brazil. Of course, you add your own flavor and add your own priorities, but there's an enhancement that has to take place. So we're quite optimistic that the US will do the same.
Are you?
Absolutely. Beyond that, though, it's not just about what the chair is going to do. It's also about what the whole G20 ecosystem is going to do. For example, for us as AU, the majority of the agreements have to find expression in our day-to-day work at the African Union. And we anticipate the same for the EU, for example, so that we don't then end up with talk shops.
Yeah.
And that is the commitment that the leaders are making among ourselves, even as you listen to some of the inputs that they're making today, and I'm sure tomorrow, is really around how do we carry the work forward continuously, And the chair will guide us, of course, and we're optimistic on a continuation of the agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not saying this precisely because you've sort of created all these platforms, whether it's civil society, it's business, organized labor, and so on. You've created this system that allows people to actually engage at different level and begin to influence. One example that someone cited only a day ago was that if you look at the B20, the Americans have been on it, participating fully throughout the year, and they were present when they came up with a declaration, and then they were present to take over.
Absolutely.
Something, of course, their administration is not going to do. So to the extent that you have people who matter as well, as much as governments do matter, civil society matters, the business community matters, issues of investment, and so on. So to the extent that you have buy-in from the American Chamber of Commerce, it's going to, the agenda that would have been discussed and decided here will easily make its way into the American business community in ways that perhaps at administration level won't be the case.
I mean, that is the hope, right?
No, absolutely. And I think it will happen in real terms. You're quite spot on, Vuyo, in that regard. I mean, the handing over the baton gives us some, comfort that there'll be continuation. The U.S. does have, they can add to the agenda as they wish, as the president, of course. But we're quite optimistic. We're not worried. We're quite optimistic that there'll be continuity and there'll be strengthening of the commitments made across the different engagement platforms of the G20. I mean, there's B20, as you rightly say, there's the Social Summit, there's so many other engagement platforms and engagement groups that have declarations that we would expect continuation of the work, irrespective of the president of the day.
Indeed. Lerato Mataboge, let me thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. The AU Commissioner for Infrastructure, Energy and Digitisation, joining us here on the floor of the Leaders Summit, the G20 Leaders Summit here at Nasrec. This is, of course, a special broadcast on our channel as we bring you blow-by-blow reaction and coverage of some of the sessions that are taking place currently. Of course, there are a whole range of world leaders from our country and from around the world as well. So whenever we get a chance, we do try to grab some of them to just have a small discussion about where we are at with certain things.